Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our weekly environmental news roundup. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media Project at the Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalism. SEJ produces a daily email roundup of environmental news. If you're not getting it, you should. It's free to subscribe. Look for it at sej.org. Each week on this program, we talk about what's been happening in environmental media. That's followed by a deeper dive on one or two issues. And today, I'm joined by two people. Chris Clayton is the policy editor of The Progressive Farmer, and Walter Bethgen is vice president of the National Agricultural Research Institute of Uruguay, as well as a director at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University. We'll be talking with them both in a moment, but first we've turned to a quick roundup of environmental news for the week. And hang on a second while I share the screen. It's always a process. And here we go. So I chose to put this story first because it is a first. I've been excited recently about all the attention paid to the lack of representation in positions of power by people of color and other groups that have been marginalized, and the efforts to change that. White privilege exists in part because so few people who are not white have been kept from positions where they can affect change, or simply kept from positions where they should also have a role. 3 days ago, as reported on by SEJ member Seth Borenstein, President Biden nominated the first woman and person of color to be his science advisor. Patty Prabhakar is also the first immigrant to hold that position, and I think it's appropriate to say it's about time. This is an easy story for journalists to report on. Look at your state advisory panels and their composition. Look at your state universities, do the same. And if you work in public media, cover your own governance boards. As someone who has worked for many years in public media, I can say our governance structures generally also reflect white privilege in their composition. So let's bring some sunlight to this issue. And our next story, gas storage. A couple of weeks ago, we talked on this program about energy production. So this is a good follow-up story. In Mississippi, an underground storage facility for natural gas is a major emitter of methane. That's a greenhouse gas that's 81 times more potent at warming the planet than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And a scary part of this story, much of this data is produced voluntarily by the emitters. There are few reporting requirements. So for reporters, this is a story you can certainly latch onto. While not every state has a storage dome, several do, including New York, where I live. And leaks also occur in transmission lines and at pump stations, and from other parts of natural gas infrastructure. There are maps available online that show some, if not all, of this infrastructure. And later this year, SEJ is having a webinar on energy that will in part touch on this. A quick spoiler alert, the webinar will discuss, among other things, Methane Sat. And I think this is pretty exciting. It's a new satellite launched by the Environmental Defense Fund. My work partner, Andy Revkin, had a Friday news review recently that discussed the satellite and much more about methane, so I'll put the link on the screen in just a little bit. Now, this next story touches on a recent Friday roundup that I did with SEJ's Mark Schlefstein. We talked about the dead zone off in the Gulf of Mexico. This story talks about similar problems in the Chesapeake Bay. According to estimates, the jurisdictions around the bay have reduced their nitrogen load by 49% of their target goal and 64% of their phosphorus goal. They've been working on this for many, many years. But those, for decades actually. But those who live around the bay, as I once did, know there is much more to be done. I included this story in the roundup in part because it's also one that can be easily localized by reporters. Anyone living near an agricultural area can look into nutrient runoff into local waterways, what they call non-point source pollution. And for big cities, if you live there, look at the wastewater treatment facilities. Combined sewer overflows, known as CSOs, continue to happen with too much frequency. And if you've never toured your sewage treatment plant, you should. That offers a couple of stories at least on its own. And I'll tell you about one. I was for some time an adjunct at Skidmore College, which is not that far from my home. And every year I would take the students and we would tour the water treatment plant in Saratoga Springs. And there was a story that and the students were supposed to come up with their own stories to write about the treatment plant. And I left that up to them to define what that would be. But there was one story I'd hoped that they would write, and finally someone did. They treat their water with chlorine, and until probably 10 years ago, they used chlorine gas. And they stored these chlorine gas tanks on the outside of the treatment facility, an unprotected area with two massive chlorine gas tanks. And, what could go wrong with that? Either by accident or by deliberation, something could have happened to those tanks. And if it had, the eastern side of Saratoga would have been in severe trouble if the wind were blowing in that direction. And finally, one of my students did recognize that as a story and wrote it. And I called our local newspaper, the Saratogian, and talked to the then editor at the time. And she refused to run it because she said it would scare too many people. But you can find these kinds of stories by looking at places like sewage treatment plants, and hopefully your editor would be more aggressive in putting that on the air, if indeed that were the case. So this next story is of importance to those who live in agricultural areas. This is one about Roundup, which was produced by Monsanto before that company was purchased by Bayer. And it's been a story for many years. Chris can talk more about this. People have sued the company claiming glyphosate, the main active ingredient, causes cancer. Results from those lawsuits have been mixed, with some receiving court-ordered settlements, while at least one person recently lost their case. Now a federal appeals court has rejected a claim by the Trump administration that the weed killer does not pose a serious health risk and is not likely to cause cancer in humans. Roundup is the most actively used weed killer in the world, so this story won't be going away anytime soon. And the last story, it's my favorite story of the week. See if I can get this to scroll back down here. This is, I love the use of language to frame issues, and it's something that journalists should be always aware of and think about in the way we write. In this case, it's rebranding carp as kopi. The whole idea involves getting rid of invasive species, and many methods are used. Several species of Asian carp are now found in the Mississippi River and some of its tributaries, to try and prevent their spread into the Great Lakes. Scientists are planning on using electric screens in the water. In fact, they're doing that in some areas, bubble machines and other tools. But there's an old saying, if you can't beat them, eat them. And we talked about this at an SCJ conference many years ago in New Orleans, over a dinner that featured invasive species. We ate tiger prawn, nutria, wild boar, and Formosa termites, and they were really good. And that's the idea behind the rebranding of carp as kopi. It turns out the native carp here that some of us fished for as kids are bottom feeders and have a pretty gamey taste. I know that I would throw them back rather than eat them. But Asian carp feed higher in the water column, and they claim they taste pretty good. So if you can't beat them, some people are going to try and put them on the menu. Regulators have already spent more than $60 million on control efforts to keep the fish from entering the Great Lakes. But experts think up to 50 million pounds of the fish could be netted and eaten each year just from the Illinois River. The opportunities for stories are almost limitless, it would seem, including setting up a tasting contest. Don't tell folks which one is which. See what happens. The country is getting more and more invasive, so these sorts of stories are going to become even more prevalent, and that means it makes sense for us to find ways to cover these stories appropriately. And that's it for our roundup. Let's get rid of this screen and get back to our guests. So Chris Clayton is an SCJ member and a Midwestern journalist with the Progressive Farmer. Chris, could you tell us briefly about your background and what got you here to this conversation today?
Sure. Appreciate you having me on, Dale, as well. So I'm an agricultural reporter. I work for DTN, the Progressive Farmer. I write about really everything under the sun when it comes to agriculture, but primarily focus on government policy in agriculture. Coming out of college, I can tell you the last thing in the world I probably wanted to cover would have been agriculture. But living in the Midwest, you really can't get away from it in some sense. So In 2001, the Omaha World Herald made me the agriculture reporter. I moved to DTN in 2005, and I moved to DTN really just about the time that the first renewable fuel standard was passed. My interest and focus on climate issues came from that, primarily because when the renewable fuel standard was passed, to me, it was probably one of the biggest economic stimulus movements in the Midwest that I think I had seen in my lifetime. The entire time I'd been alive, the whole focus and idea from farmers was they didn't want their kids to go into agriculture because it was such a poor struggle all of the time. And when the renewable fuel standard went into effect, agriculture started booming. And we had a stretch from about 2009 to 2014 where agriculture really took off. And I began to look at all the different aspects involved in renewable energy. Living in Iowa, we have the second most volume of wind turbines in the country, behind Texas, the most per capita, though. So we also get about 35% of our electricity from wind power as well. So we have, the biggest biofuels industry in the country, in the world, really, and also a high volume of wind power. Because of that, we've had about $30 billion of investment from data companies. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all these companies have come into Iowa because they want to be someplace that's drawing a high percentage of wind energy. So we've had these different aspects that have changed our economy in the Midwest by focusing on renewable energy. And I know everybody, particularly all of my environmental reporter friends, can point out every single negative aspect of biofuels. And, I can argue with some of it. I can agree with some of it. I have yet to find a power solution in the world that does not have negative impacts. But we have a lot of renewable power in the Midwest, and that has kind of definitely changed how you cover agriculture. Now you're an energy reporter. Now you're a climate reporter. And so these are some of the aspects that basically got me focusing on climate change.
And to be clear about this, when you talk biofuels, that means a lot of corn produced into ethanol, right? That's a huge chunk. So there's that shift. But also when you talk about wind, I'm presuming a lot of that popped up on agricultural land and solar as well.
On agricultural land, and now we have tremendous pushback coming. It used to be we didn't really have that. There was an economic reason and value that people saw. But in my county right now, we have a big fight over a wind farm, and we have people pushing back resisting solar farms as well. So now we have gotten to a real point in rural America where we are seeing a lot more pushback on these sort of things than maybe we saw 10, 15 years ago from people. Not in my backyard kind of situations. And that is a growing fight across the country as well.
Interesting. There's a lot of research also with solar panels and farming underneath solar panels, which I find to be really interesting, which is a great story that people in ag areas should be looking at, I think, because there's been some really interesting work being done on that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so Walter Bethgen is Vice President of the National Agricultural Research Institute of Uruguay, as well as the Director at IRI at Columbia. Walter, I'm happy to have you join us. Same question for you. Briefly, what life experience got you to the point where you are today, and how that informs your work now?
So first, thank you for inviting me, Dale, to this. I was born in Uruguay, a small country in South America, and I was always interested in agriculture production. Uruguayan economic depend a lot of the farming, and so I was always exposed to that. And so when I went to college, I studied agriculture engineering, and I did some work in the country, but then I wanted to go to a graduate school, and I came to the States. I studied in Virginia Tech, and there when I was getting my PhD, and I was working in subjects that are typically agronomic, like how to optimize the use of nitrogen fertilizer for wheat production or for corn production. But while I was doing that, we got a proposal to funded by the EPA, where they were really worried about something you just mentioned. They were worried about the runoff of fertilizers into the Chesapeake Bay. And so, I continue working in the same issues, trying to optimize the use of fertilizers for crop production. But now, for the first time in my life, I started to look at different or another dimension. I typically was just looking at what are the profits for the farmer, and what is the optimum rate and the way to timing of the fertilizer. Now I started interacting with people that were in the fishing industry in the Chesapeake Bay, and the problems that we're having with contamination. So suddenly I became a lot more interested into this other dimension of environmental impacts of how we produce food. And so the rest of my PhD program, I dedicated to that, to this interface between agriculture production systems, and environmental impact. And then, my first job, I was also very interested always in developing countries and how to improve production systems and in general, livelihoods in developing countries. So my first job was in an international institute that was looking at exactly the same thing. It was looking at how can we improve the fertilizer use in developing countries to make it more sustainable, but with, I would say, not a very explicit interest in the environmental impacts. But I had brought this from college, right, from Virginia. So I started introducing there too that impact, and I got more and more involved in environmental impacts of food production. And of course, as soon as you get into that, you start considering the impact of climate variability, the impact of climate change, and the other way around. What is the impact that agricultural production is having on the climate change issue? So then I became more interested in this within the interface of environment and agriculture. I was especially interested in climate, and from different points of view. I'm very interested in what is the impact of agriculture on climate change, but I am also very interested in what is the type of climate information that we can provide to farmers to inform their decisions, inform their planning activities. And this is what I have been doing the center that I direct now in Colombia. What we do is exactly that. What is the type of information, of knowledge that we need to generate that is related to climate that can effectively inform decisions at the farmer, in the agricultural production system, but also we work in public health, in energy, in natural ecosystems. So that's what brings me to where I am today. This interest in bringing down to Earth the scientific climate information or climate related information. How can we connect that to inform policy, to inform decisions, to inform public health systems, etc.?
It's I always love this part of the conversation because I'm fascinated in people's journeys that get them to where they are. But also, you raised something that so my program is trying to help journalists look at resilience issues, and resilience issues to me is simply complexity. How do you cover issues of complexity? And you've already reminded me of something in what you've said here, which is that I was sort of framing this program around the effects of climate change on agriculture. But as you pointed out, agriculture has an effect on climate change, and there's that complexity in the system that has these feedback loops. So I'm going to ask Chris to start asking some questions in a minute here as well. But first, tell us, if you could, a little bit about the impacts of agriculture on climate and what that role has been.
So, if you look at that, when I talk about the things, especially for general audiences, the first thing that I make sure that I remind everybody is, why do we have this climate change? We have climate change because we have been emitting greenhouse gases for a long time. And so the natural greenhouse effect that we need in this planet to live, right? So the greenhouse effect is something that we needed and has been here for millions of years. What has been happening is that we emitted so much greenhouse gases now that it's like having a greenhouse with a thicker glass in the roof. So now we are trapping more heat, and that is creating a lot of impacts on the global climate. Now, so the reason we were having climate change is because we have been emitting greenhouse gases. And what I make sure that I remind people when we talk about the impact of agriculture on climate change is, let's remember what is the source, the main source of greenhouse gases today. And the main, 70% of the greenhouse gases come from energy. So we have to remind that. Then we can discuss a lot of other things. We can discuss how we can improve other sectors, but let's not forget that 70% of the greenhouse gases come from the energy sector. Now, how is agriculture, or how has agriculture been affecting these greenhouse gas emissions and balances in different ways? And this is another thing that I think is critical. When let's talk the livestock production. If you talk to a person, especially a person that is not familiar with agricultural production, I believe that they have this mental image that livestock production is one big thing, one homogeneous thing. And so livestock production is responsible for X% of greenhouse gases and the methane emissions. And the reality is that there's not a livestock production system. There are many different and very, very different production systems. So you have a production system of livestock in a place that starts with a tropical forest. You cut that forest, you burn that forest, you plant a pasture, and then you raise cattle. That's one extreme of livestock production system. On the other extreme, you have these places that are natural grasslands that have been grazed by herbivores for at least 8 million years, and where the herbivores are part of the equilibrium of that natural ecosystem. And you're producing livestock in those environments too, completely different. In one case, you would have a very carbon-rich environment. You destroy that environment, you plant your pasture, you raise your cattle. In another place, what you're doing is basically emulating what nature has been doing for millions of years. Now, they're both livestock production systems. One is clearly non-sustainable, the other one may be. And so this is an example with livestock, but we could use the same example in other agriculture.
And with livestock, there are many variations between those two. There's confined animal feed operations, exactly, which concentrate the methane production, and so there's a range.
Yeah, so talking about livestock production is like talking about cars. When you say cars are bad for the environment, cars are bad for the greenhouse gas emissions, what car are you talking about? A car that, like a Humvee, a car that you can ride 1 kilometer with 1 liter? Are you talking about a hybrid where you can drive 40 kilometers with 1 liter? Or are you talking about an electric car that has 0 greenhouse gas emissions? So I think one thing that is critical for bringing the discussions to a rational level and to a constructive level is, let's not caricaturize. There's not a livestock production system. There's not a soybean production system. There's not a corn production system. There are many. And it's very important that we work in characterizing them and understanding how they work. In the specific case of methane that you mentioned also in your summary, I think there was another thing that happened very recently. I thought it was very interesting. So if you look at these sources, again, of greenhouse gases, right, which are creating the climate change problem, about 5% of those emissions come from the livestock production systems. But the interesting thing is that almost the same amount of methane comes from these fuels that you were mentioning, of methane of fossil fuels. So if you look at the coal mining venting, the losses in the transmission lines from natural gas to the homes, if you sum all those emissions, the total emission of methane from fossil fuels is the same amount of the total emissions from the livestock production system. Now, you probably know that in Scotland, in Glasgow, in the last conference of the parties in the climate change convention, there was an agreement where many countries agreed to reduce by 20% the emissions of methane. And so countries like where I was born, which has a lot of cattle, they thought, oh, this is very bad news for Uruguay. If they had got... The interesting thing is that there is a paper produced right before Glasgow by specialists in methane. And what they found out is that if the companies that own these natural gas companies or oil companies and the coal miners, if they are able to trap the methane that are being lost now, they can do that trapping, 20% of the total losses they can trap at negative cost. In other words, if they can trap it and sell it as natural gas, they will be making money. So that is exactly the 20% that countries agreed to cut methane.
And it's interesting because in self-reporting, it's been shown time and time again that they're underestimating. So perhaps that figure could be higher. Yeah.
And the other key thing that you mentioned, Dale, is the new satellite. Because one of the reasons why companies were saying, it's very difficult to work in these losses, in these fugitive losses that we have in the fossil fuels, is that it's very difficult to detect. And now these new satellites that the US and the European space agencies are sending to space, they're going to be able to tell you exactly where are your losses, exactly where in this oil drill or in this natural gas place you are losing methane. Where are the losses in the lines? So now, it makes sense to trap, even because you can do it with a benefit for the company. And two, by doing that, one great impact of cutting methane is that it has a very high, very strong warming potential, but it has a very short life. It lives about 10 years. So if you cut the emissions of methane, you have an immediate impact on global temperature, which is wonderful. So, we were supposed to be talking about agriculture and not the fossil fuels, but the reason why I bring this to the conversation is that, one, when we think of agriculture, we have to think of a very complex system that has a lot of variation. And two, if we're really going to be serious about climate change and combating climate change, we cannot lose the focus. Where are the main sources and problems, but also opportunities?
Well, I appreciate you for giving us a better grounded framing of that, and that's important. So I want to move on to the other end of that, which is what climate change is doing to agriculture. But Chris, do you have some thoughts you want to add in on this part before we move into the next aspect of it?
I always think that the aspect of climate change and agriculture that gets lost in the discussion, especially among the most passionate advocates for reducing emissions, is that everybody has to eat. We lose that context that agriculture and food production is the one true thing we need to have in the world. Right now we are in a mass, the G7 is meeting in Germany right now, discussing global food crisis because we have a war going on that is reducing food production, and we have an immediate global food crisis because of it. So when we start fixating and focusing on livestock emissions and if you want to switch and talk more about crop emissions, then we can talk about nitrous oxide emissions and so on and so on. But we have a growing global population, and I always think that the issue, part of the equation that gets lost is, there's 7.5 billion people that rely on global agriculture every single day. And it's going to be 8 billion. It's going to be 9. We're projected to be 10 billion by 2050. So I just always want to kind of add that element into the discussion that, we really want to talk and change about changing our food systems. We also have to put into context the fact that we have global food crises that come up all the time. And the one thing in the world everybody has to do is eat. So I just want to kind of drop that aspect in there as we move forward here.
I actually saw a great presentation earlier this week at Columbia where they were talking about a lot of different things. And there's so much we could spin down into in this because it's such a complex and wonderful and engaging topic. But they were talking about food waste. Something, I forget the figure, 40% of food is wasted. So if you cut that in half, you can feed people and reduce emissions at the same time. So there's so many levels to this that I will point out are great entryways for journalists who want to cover this issue.
And the only time I went to a global climate conference was in San Francisco, probably 5 or 6 years ago. I don't remember exactly what year it was. It was a big climate conference in San Francisco. I wanted to go into the back and look at all of the food that was being thrown away from all of the people at the conference, and the security people would not allow me to go back there and take a look at all of that stuff. No, that was off limits, right? We're here to tell you you're got to be restricted to this area. And I'm like, yeah, but we're talking about, somebody was just talking about food waste. I wanted to go look. No, that dog won't hunt. So
Yeah.
That would be a great story. So Walter, why don't we shift to that then? Let's start talking about the effect of climate change on the food that we do eat today. The grains, in particular, is one area where the production of grain is going to be reduced because of the increased CO2. But tell me more about that, if you could.
So let me tell you first, just to complement what Chris was saying. One of the, I'm gonna go back to my personal story. It's like as I started getting more interested in the interface of environment, climate, agriculture, I realized that what really interested me is the food systems. It's the whole process, since the food is produced until it's consumed or wasted. And so this is what we're doing now in Colombia, is working in the food system. The new climate school has a big theme that is sustainable and healthy food system. And why is this? When I look at the numbers, they're really amazing. Let's say we have about 7 billion people today. Today, counting the impact of the war is difficult, but at least about 800 million people go to bed hungry every day. So 7 billion people, 800 million people undernourished. But then you have coexisting with that, you have 2 billion people that are overweight. You have another 2 billion people that have hidden hunger. So they're eating the right amount of calories, but not the right nutrients. So basically, if you do a very rough calculation, about half of the world, at least half of the world, is being malnourished, right? And so there's something we need to do about that. There's something that we need to do something very quickly about that. One of the reasons behind this situation is, of course, poverty. If you can see in any country in the world, as soon as the country starts increasing their income, they change the diet. So if you look at China today compared to China 20 years ago, China is consuming 8 times more meat, poultry and pork and beef than 20 or 30 years ago, because the income went up. And the meats, one thing that the meats have are they're nutrient rich, they're very high density of nutrients. And so, and their bioavailability of the nutrients is, of course, is very good if you in the meat. And so one thing that has to do with this imbalance and this problem of malnutrition is that. The other thing is, what are the crops that we are favoring, that we are promoting? Today, about almost $600 billion are spent in subsidies for crop production. $600 billion per year. Now, almost 100% of those subsidies goes to rice, corn, and wheat. And this is why those crops are cheaper. Now, if you take the example of what happened in renewables that Chris was mentioning before, what happened in renewables? 30 years ago, if you wanted to produce 1 kilowatt of electricity with a solar panel, it cost $10,000. 1 kilowatt 30 years ago. Today, it costs 5.5 cents. What happened in the middle? A lot of funds, injections, a lot of funding, promoting technology, research. And today, it's cheaper to generate 1 megawatt with renewables than with oil. We need to use the same mentality for food.
And that's despite all the subsidies for fossil fuels still in place today. Yeah,
exactly. And so, and also before taking the impact of the Ukraine war, this is before the war. It was cheaper to produce 1 kilowatt with renewables than with fossil fuels. And so, we need a similar movement in the food systems. If we start injecting funds to promote more healthy foods, to promote research in increasing the nutritional value of what people eat, you will have the same revolution that we have in the renewable energy. And so that's one part that I wanted to mention. The other part is your question, is how is climate change affecting agriculture production? And one of the things that worries me is that most of the work in research that tries to connect climate change with agriculture, what they do is they say, okay, what are the climate models saying that it will happen in 2070? Well, the climate models say that the temperature will go up, the rainfall will do this, and then they connect this climate change future, long, way long in the future scenarios with some crop models, and they say, the crop production will go down, corn will be affected, maybe in Canada they get a better growing season. But they're talking about 2070, 2080. So the question is, what do we do today? I think if you place the problem of climate change in the very far future scenarios, it has been great to raise awareness. Now everybody's talking about climate change. But if you really want to connect it to action, we need to take climate change as a problem of today. It's already happening. It has been happening. So what do we do it? And one of the great things that I like of the last IPCC report is that they say now there is scientific, undebatable evidence that the climate extreme events have been increasing in frequency and in damage. And this is what really affects a farmer. A farmer is not affected by the fact that you will have a 2-degree change in 100 years. What really affects a farmer is that today, this year, you have a very bad drought. Next year, you have floods. Then you have, this variability. And what the climate change, now we have undebatable, scientifically very robust information and evidence, is that climate change is increasing the volatility, increasing this extreme event frequency and damage. So the question is, what do we do about that? If I think we were discussing before this, what is the impact of increasing the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere in the nutritional value of a crop?
Right, which is a huge question. Can we talk about that a little bit? What does that, well, and I mean, there's several things in what you're saying, and a little bit of pushback in that 50 years, would we have generations of farmers using the same techniques, the same practices, basically? 50 years is not a long time to affect change in a system that has that much inertia. So go ahead, Chris.
I would just add one simple thing. If you actually go back and look at previous climate studies, that's, go back and look at what was written by climate scientists 30, 40, 50 years ago and what they were modeling is happening now. EPA put out a great report in 1989 about the impacts of climate change in the future. And it is astounding how many things they have forecast that have actually are happening now. Algal blooms, snowpack reductions in California. California, they were saying 40 years ago was going to have massive amounts of wildfires and have a lot more water challenges. The things that the scientists were saying 30, 40 years ago are the things that we are seeing now. And they're doing it, and they predicted it in really good fashion. So it isn't just looking at what was forecast for coming in 40 years, but what they're saying is happening now.
And the model is even better now. So
the modeling is even better,
even more accurate.
Exactly. The technology is even better at the moment. So just
Chris,
wanted.
This will tell you how old I am. I was part of that EPA report.
Were you?
Yeah.
That is my favorite report on climate change.
Yeah. So it was the first time that EPA asked us to connect climate change in late 80s. Nobody even was talking about climate change, and crop production, food production, and so it was a fantastic experience. And of course, I hope I didn't come across like saying that these future scenarios are not important. What I'm saying is that we need some action today.
Well, and that's what I want to get at. So you talked about the three main crops: wheat, corn, and rice. Their production generally in many places is heavily fossil fuel intensive. And so there's a feedback loop. We're using grains that contribute more fossil fuel or contribute more greenhouse gases, which is only going to increase the damage from the storms, but also the decrease in nutritional value, which is something I find really interesting what the studies are showing now. So if we can, let's get more nitty gritty in some of these finer effects. And one is that there's discussion about other grains like spelt that people are starting to talk about, but that people won't eat. How do we, what are these effects? What are these more granular effects? And how do we begin to change that quickly? Because as you've so clearly pointed out, we need to focus on now.
Yeah, so what the research is showing is that with an increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, the resulting, the impacts on photosynthesis and on the plant physiology results in less nutritious food, right? So,
and is that because the extra carbon they focused this was researched a few years ago, but that they thought the carbon would make the plants grow faster and higher. So is more of the production energy going into that rather than into the grain? Is that how the mechanism works here?
Right. So if you imagine, if you imagine a plant opens, its tissue to let the carbon, the CO2 in the atmosphere go in, then they do photosynthesis. And that opening and closing of the tissues is what determines the water cycle, also how much water they can use and they transpire. If you have an atmosphere that is richer in CO2, then you need that less time open with this. You need less. It's like fertilizing. You're fertilizing. That's what some crops are being, for a long time, are artificially fertilized in greenhouse, so that you increase the efficiency of photosynthesis, you increase the productivity, but you have that problem, is you have this dilution effect, right? So now, but then again, if I think of like a farmer, right? If I think of, this is what that shows is, with a gradual increase in CO2 concentration, the nutritional value of crops will go down. Unless crop breeding efforts can tackle that problem. But let's suppose that they can't. But I'll tell you an example with protein. If you're producing wheat in a place, right? And let's say the average yield that you get is 5 tons. If you have an outstandingly good growing season, and instead of producing 5 tons, you produce 8 or 9, the first thing that will happen is that the protein content of that wheat goes down. And this happens from one year to the next one. And I'm talking about going from 12% to 9 or 10%. Huge impact. And this happened just because you had a very favorable season, and the opposite. If you have a season that is not that good and the yields are pretty bad, then you can be pretty sure that the protein content of that low production crop will probably be higher. And so the question is, how do we balance this knowledge that we're having, where the knowledge is telling, little by little, the CO2, the carbon dioxide concentration affects the nutritional value, but at the same time, the year-to-year variability has huge impact on the nutritional value of those same crops.
So what's the answer?
The answer is both. The answer is, there is this trend that is dangerous. There is this trend caused by the long-term climate change that we have to try as much as possible to revert, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, to try to really stop these impacts on climate change. But from a practical standpoint, all these effects that we are talking about are huge from year to year. So if you look at the last 100 years, total variation observed in rainfall wherever in the world, including the United States, you take of the whole variation in rainfall that we observed in the last 100 years, how much has to do with this long-term change? And typically in the world, that value is 10%, 15%. 80 or 90% of what happened in the last 100 years has to do with this year-to-year variability. Does that mean that climate change is not important? No, climate change is critical. It's probably the most important challenge that we face today. But what we need to do, I believe, to get more action, to get more activities going on now, is to focus in what can we do today. And in order to focus in what can we do today is, on the one hand, how can we reduce all these emissions? On the other hand, is how do we manage these risks, this volatility, this huge variability that farmers confront?
I understand what you're saying here, but what about those other effects? I mean, there's a lot of discussion now about changing the crops that we grow to make them more appropriate for the current climate and the future climate. Is that something that you would advocate for? Are those sorts of? So I get the way you're presenting this, but what about looking toward that next 50 years, and how do we get crops that will maintain the nutritional value and that will provide what the food people need. As Chris says, you need food, shelter, and uh, clothing. These are the three
Well,
things we
this
need.
is something that the farmers who do not till their fields, that plant cover crops and things of that nature, they have been wanting more studies and research about how you change practices and what that does to the nutrient intensity of the crops and the nutrients that are in the crops. One of the problems that we have when it comes to nutrients in the crops is that you have fields that have been farmed for 50, 60, 70 years, and those crops have absorbed the micronutrients out. But if you are planting and diversifying your crop mix, if you are making different changes, what does that do to the nutrient intensity of your crops? And farmers would love to see more research on just what exactly those changes are, so they can know that, hey, I'm growing this way, and by doing that, I am increasing the protein. I'm also adding more zinc into my, all of these different things that we don't really know exactly, some of the micronutrients that we've lost in our food because of those things. So that is something they have wanted to see more of, is more of that kind of data, so they can make those kind of adjustments.
And we know some of this already. I mean, we know that monocropping depletes soil of certain micronutrients and things like phosphorus, where you might get legumes that will fix that in the soil. So that's the whole idea of rotating crops. So we've known some of that already. So is one of the answers this sort of more micronutrient level of research that not only would increase nutrients, but also, if you have that, you don't necessarily need to put down as much fertilizer, which
Right.
is fossil fuel intensive too.
Yeah, but also in addition to, we are now involved in a very large NSF project that is studying what is the impact of including more pastures in your crop rotations. And one of the reasons is that, one of the reasons is, if you have only crops, what you're doing is like mining the soil. You just take things with a grain, take things with a grain. If you have a production system that alternates crops with good, recycling of the residues, and on top of that you add crops or pastures for a couple of years that can replenish some of these nutrients. On top of these nutrients is a physical characteristic of the soil. If you farm and farm and farm a soil, and you start degrading the soil organic carbon, the soil organic matter, the soil becomes more degraded, and the water holding capacity becomes affected. The ability to supply nutrients becomes affected. So, what the question is, how do we design crop production systems that alternate with cover crops and pastures, the only function of those crops is to replenish the soil and to maintain the soil physical properties. And the difficulty of that is that, you need a lot of years to start seeing the impact of that type of practice. The beauty of the United States is that there are a lot of sites that they have been measuring these things for a long time, for decades. And if you use those experimental sites to calibrate and to adjust and to test simulation models, then you can start developing these tools that will say, okay, what will happen in my condition that I'm doing soybean, corn, soy. If in that system I add 1 year with oats or 1 year with a legume grass mix, and you can start answering those questions based on research, based on experimental results, but using crop simulation models.
Do you know offhand where that data is available? Is there
The
is there a quick website that you can mention that journalists can look at?
it's the big problem is called LTA, and I can't remember long term. I can't remember what it is, but it's they have very famous experiments like the one in the Kellogg station, and
Okay.
one in Nebraska.
And to visit farmers who are doing this, you go to Burleigh County, North Dakota, the Jerusalem of cover crops in the United States, where guys like Gabe Brown and others are, implementing cover crops in this way, 15, 18, 20 species cover crops. They're putting their cattle on it. They're changing how they rotate things. There are a few counties in the country that have really embraced this sort of thing. That's the area that where I've seen some of the most progressive farmers in the country focusing on those things.
And I appreciate you bringing up the whole micronutrients aspect. This is the thing for journalism, that it's so easy to get buried down in minutia and not lift your head up and see some of these broader things. And I was thinking about phosphorus and nitrogen, but it's also the depletion of the micronutrients, which also affects the nutrient content of the grains that we're eating. So that's all critically important. And we have a lot of farmland in the Midwest in particular that it's not a dead zone, but it's more compacted because so much has been drawn, and that's what you're saying about capacity to hold water. If it's that hard, it's going to roll off. So you're not replenishing aquifers. There's all sorts of layers in here to understand to be able to address this. We're coming up on an hour. If you have a few more minutes to stay with, I'd like to keep this going a little bit more, if that's okay. If you guys can, if you have the time to do that, just a few more minutes.
I just want to touch upon when you're changing crops, though. You have to talk to the farmers about these aspects. It doesn't make any sense for a farmer to try to grow quinoa if he has no way to sell that crop.
Right.
They are all running an individual business. So when we all talk collectively about changing crop mixes, you have to figure out, who's going to be the market for that product and purchase it in a way that is going to make it financially viable for, 100,000 farmers to change what they're growing.
And that's a regional thing too, right? I mean, I'm as a non-farmer, that in the Pacific Northwest, that crop might have a great market, whereas in the Southeast it would not. So it's impractical to do that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And what Chris just brought up I think is critical, and this is the reason why some universities are changing the way that we're approaching these problems. Because the typical way is that if you look at something from the soil nutrient dimension and you forget the rest of the story, you will get great results. You can publish wonderful articles in papers, in journals, but it's completely unfeasible. Now, this is the reason why now, for example, in Colombia, what we're doing is in this new climate school, when we approach a problem, let's say we are looking at food production. Yes, of course, we need people from agronomy, agriculture, production system, but we need also the nutritionist, and we need the economist, and we need the anthropologist, and we need the person of human behavior, because otherwise we're producing very interesting knowledge, but completely useless. And so, this idea of looking at a problem and integrating all these different disciplines, which end being more realistic. This is what any decision maker does. There's not a single decision maker that is looking at one little dimension when you make a decision. You have many types of many different factors affecting what you're going to decide. And so this new trend that I'm especially excited about the Columbia Climate School because of that, because the realization of do you really want to inform real decisions, real policies, then forget about your little dimension and start looking at this as a problem, as an integrated problem that needs input from many more disciplines than yours. And this is great. This is how to avoid the type of situation that Chris was saying. Is you create this wonderful production system, but the farmer will never adopt it because he doesn't have a way to sell the product.
All right, so let's do the last 5 minutes real quickly. The thing we haven't done as much of is what are the entry points for journalists who may not be covering agriculture on a regular basis, how they can get into these. And I always, I love these programs because I get reminded of my blinders and my biases. And the first one after this last part of the conversation is the first thing you should do, talk to farmers. So up in my part of the woods in the North Country of New York State, there's Essex Farms, there's a Tangleroot Farm, there's Soulfire Farm, a woman there, a black woman who is farming, which is still unusual in this part of the country, but increasing more, who's done a lot of writing about traditions of black farmers, the historic traditions of black farmers, and their ability to be stewards of the land. So talk to farmers. There's also ag extension agents. Every state has a land grant college that does this. What are some other entry points to help them cover some of these issues?
Well, going back basically to focusing on talking to farmers, but basically looking at the how what's going on, particularly with you can start simple by, if you don't have any connections to farmers, I don't care where you are in the country, you have a farmers market, and going to that Saturday farmers market and visiting with the people there who are either growing vegetables or they're selling meat or what have you, and each of them has a different kind of story about what's going on. Each of them has a different kind of pressure point. Whether it, the thing up in your area of the country, was a great story out of the New York Times of just a couple of weeks ago about all the people from the city going up there and buying the farmland. Well, they're making it harder for young people to buy farmland. They're also telling the farmers there that they ought to do things that are totally impractical. That was a really fascinating piece, just how urban people coming in and their own perceptions, they want the, pastoral idea of what a farmer should be. Tracing
and they're gentlemen farmers and they're putting llamas on.
Yeah. Everybody in the country has a school district, and they have all kinds of nutritional demands on those school districts of what they are supposed to be providing, that keep changing all the time. Right now we're having a debate in Congress about continuing to provide free food for those school districts. And, they're voting on this stuff literally right now to try to ensure that happens. But I went to my niece's school district, and we were talking about all of the changes in food that they liked and didn't like, that was making them healthy. And the thing that they all ripped out of, they all hated sweet potato French fries. And you talk to adults and in their 50s and 60s, and they all love it, but the teenage kids hated sweet potato French fries. That was a really fascinating thing. So nobody was eating it,
They're not nutritious if you don't eat them.
Yeah, they're exactly. So they were, there are.
Well, you've combined two things there that have been in my area. The farmers market, I was very actively involved with them years ago, and they were trying to get their food into the schools and have the schools use, instead of Cisco or one of the big production houses, to have local produce in there and provide a market for some of these smaller farmers. The problem was scale. They needed a lot more, and they needed reliability. They couldn't just do it, in the summertime when schools aren't in place, or for a couple of months in the fall. They need it all year round. How can the farmers do that? So there's all this sort of logistical problems that they face in trying to do that. The school was interested in trying to figure that out, but in the end, they were buying apples. That was about the only local agricultural stuff they could get in the schools. So, Walter, do you have any? You're not a journalist, but when you talk to journalists, are there any tips that you give them as ways to begin to look at these kinds of stories?
So one of the things that I like to do when talking to journalists is to challenge them, is to go against everything they believe they know, right? The reason is some of the examples that we discussed today. So I bet that if you talk to an urban person and you say agriculture, the first thing that today they will think is, oh, agriculture is contaminating the environment. Or if you talk about livestock, oh, livestock is the worst. It's worse than oil or natural gas. And so, who is creating these opinions? Who has the ability to question these things? And so, one of the things that I really like is when I find journalists that are ready to challenge everything that is supposed to be known, everything that common sense or that general knowledge is supposed to give us a truth. And so, I love when I find this type of journalists. And my, I don't have Chris' experience, but my suggestion is to find this type of people in the universities, in civil society, in NGOs. There are a lot of people that are trying to think differently. Is to say, okay, I don't have to accept this, general knowledge concepts, and I'm going to question them, and I'm going to, explore a little bit more. And so, is agriculture really contaminating and being such an important thing for climate change? Let's bring some information. Let's discuss this with an open mind. That's the only thing that I would say. And I love when I find people, especially journalists, that come with that mentality. It's a lot of fun because you have these people that have this art of communicating, right, and therefore contributing to form opinion and form culture. But they're open. They start with this. I'm not sure I know about this. I heard this. What do you think? And then I'm going to check with another person. What do you think? And so I love that. I really, that's the thing that I enjoy the most.
And Chris, I cut you off when you're talking about schools because I got so excited about that. Were there other things you're going to mention?
That was really, a major focus, was just bringing that up. And then I heard the other day somebody talk about, the same kind of conversation about chefs, and I would change the mindset to saying cooks instead. I personally have a bias against chefs. We have this, I don't want to criticize any specific publications or anybody else, but they always talk about these chefs that use sustainable products or whatever. Well, there's one in particular out in California that is quoted a great deal, very famous restaurant and everything. The problem is to go to that restaurant, it's $125 a plate.
Right.
What in the world is sustainable about that? That is just not sustainable. Think about it. The three of us eating there tonight would be $500 minimum. And I just lose my mind when I see that, quote, sustainably produced menu, etc. There's nothing sustainable about that in my mind, because, people who shop and eat at Walmart can't fathom the idea of going to that restaurant. Look at the moment right now, our biggest debate and topics are food and gas inflation. Both of them intermix directly with climate change in different ways, but the things that we try to do to reduce inflation immediately are very counterproductive to what we're talking about when it comes to climate change pressures. And we're caught right in the middle of that debate right at the moment.
Well, the other thing that, just in listening to both of you through this program, the other thing that I would say for journalists to look at is markets. I really love the idea of, because journalism is about educating, right? It's about educating people about what's happening around their communities and the idea of what markets, what crops are economically possible in a community and where those come from. And the other aspect, so my resilience program in the past, when we were able to have fellowships back when people could gather more, it was focused on sheds. So the way for me to try and introduce the idea of complexity in issues is the idea of water sheds, energy sheds, and food sheds. And I think that's another great way for people, for journalists to have an entry point to these sorts of stories is a food shed. Where does your food come from? As COVID showed us, supply lines are brittle. Supply lines are easily broken. A lot of our produce comes from the valley out in California right now. And if there's a trucker strike or if there's let's see, a mega drought that happens to be going on right now, what are the effects on your local community, the foods you get? So if you think in terms of sheds for these stories, I think that brings up a lot of other topics we can cover too. Look, we've gone on longer than I had expected, and I'm greatly appreciate both of you and for spending the time with us. That's it for our programs today. I want to thank you both, Chris Clayton of the Progressive Farmer, Walter Bethgen of Columbia University. Next week, Andy Revkin will have our program. And if you want to watch this program or any other program in the series, check out Andy's YouTube page where these are all stored. So thanks to you for joining us. Thanks for our viewers who have been watching. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
inviting me.